Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another in the Revelation series. We're part of this theological track. We're now in Revelation chapter 17. And what we'll find from this chapter is that it provides a contrast between the woman in Revelation 12, right? God's true church who stands on the moon, which is the lesser light. We learned this is the Bible and the spirit of prophecy, being the greater light being God himself. In this chapter, we'll see a portrait of the counterpart. So that's the woman who is the false church, and also get a sense of her false daughters. So the chapter starts off, right, with verse 1. It opens a scene where one of the angels who had the seven vials talked with John and says, "Come hither." Also for context, real quick, the last two chapters we saw would ultimately be is shown what would happen with those who aligned around the false doctrines, right? Those that did not come out of Babylon, we saw what happened in the last two chapters for them. In chapter 17, we're now, as well as in the next chapter, 18, and also part of 19, we'll learn about the judgment of Babylon. So it's almost like a little mini court case, if you will. Verse 1 through 6 of this is going to lay out the crimes, for which God executes the judgment upon the harlot, the Roman papacy. Then in verses 7 through 18, we're going to see how the false church will be punished. So the angel says, "Come and see, and I will show thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth on many waters, whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication." So now, notice she's called the great whore. According to Ephesians 5, Jesus is the spiritual husband of the church. Therefore, if a church unites or receives favors with one that's not her husband, she's committing spiritual adultery, right? So the kings of the earth represent these civil powers, which the churches lose power of the gospel and transform hearts and lives. And, they turn the power of the state to support their doctrines, and then they ultimately commit this spiritual fornication. So the many waters are the countless people that have been made drunk by the doctrines of the whore. So we continue the next verse. So the angel with the seven vials carried me away in the spirit, this is talking about John here, into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit on a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. That's familiar. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color and decked out with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. We actually just showed in the last chapter about that golden cup, that golden chalice. So if we were to kind of visualize this, right, taking a quick pause, we would see this woman's described, and she's, got sun worship, right? She has this golden chalice of false doctrine, and yet she's masked as Christianity. So, I asked my buddy Laramie. I said, mock this up for me. What would you create, right? And we have this lady in a robe, a cup of pagan sun worship, holding a cross, to symbolize this infiltration of Christianity. And it's interesting because the Vatican designers who envisioned kind of the same depiction, here's actually the coin, the Vatican coin, and they're not even hiding the fact that they are the whore of Babylon. Interesting also, if you go into the bottom here, it says fides, right? So if we find out, that 33-degree Mason Albert Mackey states in the Manual of the Lodge that the Lodge ultimately has worshipped under the deity of the name of Fides, right? And an altar of Fides under the name of the goddess of oaths. So Numa, which would have been that first who erected the altar to Fides under the name of the goddess of oaths. So a little bit interesting. I have a whole course on this in Public Secrets. I also recommend looking up Walter Veith and what he has to say on the matter. With this, let's continue on. So there's this whore on a dragon, and upon her forehead was written, "Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots, and abomination of the earth." I think it's interesting, the idea of the mother of harlots. So Babylon the Great, the false church, the spiritual whore, ultimately, if she is the mother, then she has daughters. right? And so the apostate Protestant churches, which never fully separated themselves from Rome during the Protestant Reformation, would be her daughters. A quote from John Pope the 13th at the Second Vatican Council, that the papacy should be an affectionate, kind, and patient mother, and that she is compassionate and good towards her alienated children. Right? So this is a quote by the Pope that says that they identify themselves as this mother, and they are kind and good to their alienated children, and their children are the Protestant churches. Right? So what does the Bible tell us about aligning with the papacy and aligning with false doctrines? Ye are adulteresses, if ye know ye that the friendship of the world is enmity with God. Whosoever there shall be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. So it's really, really clear that we are not to be associated with. Now, this doesn't mean that we're not to be, friends with our neighbors, right? But this is saying that we are not to be partakers of her sin. Babylon is said to be the mother of harlots. By her daughters must be symbolized as churches that cling to her doctrines and traditions and follow her example of sacrificing truth and approval of God in order to form the unlawful alliance with the world. So what do these churches teach? Well, they teach Sabbath is not Sabbath on Saturday, like the Bible says, not the seventh day. They're teaching it Sabbath is on Sunday, right? They also teach that hell burns forever, which is not what's found in the Bible. And they teach the dead are not dead, and they teach spiritualism, right? So if you've analyzed these doctrines, you'll find that these don't adhere to what the Bible has to say. And yet many of us don't take the time to analyze. We just trust whatever our pastors say. Oh, if our pastor says it, then that's good. Good enough for me. But if your pastor is lost, you can't say, oh, well, my pastor told me this, because 2 Timothy 2:15 tells us we are to study to show ourselves approved. So I recommend that we analyze the doctrines of our church against what the Bible has to say. And we may find out that we're actually engaged in false doctrines, false teachings. Let's continue in verse 6. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. So she's truly drunk with the blood of the saints. And history records the deeds of the papacy and how it used the state to persecute and kill millions of faithful Christians during the Dark Ages. The Catholic Church has disguised herself with these humble apologies for these actions, but she hasn't changed. The same spirit of persecution that was demonstrated through the Dark Ages will be exhibited against God's faithful children who will not drink the wine of her corruption just before the second coming of Christ. So we can go look back at this and we can see, again, the Inquisition should still be fresh on some people's memories with this idea of the Catholic Church not allowing any other religions to exist and violently killing millions, including the Cathars and the Waldensians, to stop the original Church of Jesus and replace it with a mixture of paganism. And who were their henchmen? Well, we had, if the Pope had trading cards, here would be their most valuable players, right? You got Diego Daza, Bernard Gui, right? G. I spelled his name. I know Gui. G. Anyways, Conrad was a Catholic priest, took active part in the Crusades in France, who many historians believe to be an act of genocide. Not my words, theirs. In his egregious efforts, he was eagerly supported by Pope Innocent III and Pope Gregory. And Gregory went on to appoint Conrad as the defensor of young Elizabeth of Hungary. He took on the title of spiritual advisor. You can look into that one there. He essentially just abused her and took her power, separating her from her children, beating her, and she ended up dying at 24. So this is who the Catholic Church put out as their henchmen. The next one here used widespread torture, burning people at the stake, and his name has been synonymous with cruelty and religious intolerance and fanaticism. This one here hated the Jews and Muslims, showed excessive cruelty, so bad that reports came up to papal leadership that Disa and his men, quote, they have no regard for God or justice. They steal, kill, and rape girls. Yeah, so this is who the Pope had appointed and supported. Next up, the Catholic roster, we have Bernard Guy, and he's the Inquisitor under Pope Clement V and also Pope John XXII. And he was very aggressive and convicted about 1,000 people of heresy. 7% of them were executed, about 30% were imprisoned, and this is just the numbers that they are, that the Catholic Church put forth. I think there's a lot more than this. Ultimately, they were imprisoned or forced to wear crosses or sent to, pilgrimages, which is a weird thing that they never, not getting into that. So if we're not sure how far the Pope would go, in 1252, Pope Innocent, again, these ironic names, authorized the use of torture as a tool for Inquisition. So the medieval Inquisition was a series of inquisitions that slowly merged into a more or less continuous process of arrest, interrogation of suspected heretics. And the heretics were anyone that wants to keep the commandments of the Bible. The inquisitors often complained that they were not able to achieve the results and desired, and they wanted more power. And so the Pope granted them more power. So that is the lesson of the deeds, right? That's the court case just laid out a big piece of this, right? The blood of the saints. So we read in verse 7, I will tell you the mystery of the woman, of the beast, and that carried her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, this 7 heads and 10 horns should be very, if we've been on this track together, we just read that 5 chapters ago, right? And we've read this in Revelation chapter 12. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. So here we see this. This great red dragon we've identified is the old serpent, the devil. It said that in verse 9. So we see that the serpent, introduced in Genesis 3, seen in Revelation 13, and now here in Revelation 17, is the devil. And as for the heads, those are the both nations and people who the deceiver uses to persecute, deceive, and destroy. And we learn this from the similarities in Daniel 7 and 13, which describe a similar beast. Now, this is very reminiscent of what we saw with the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the dragon when we think of the heads. Because when we actually look at the heads of this beast, right, the heads are that of the dragon, but also of the lion, the bear, and the leopard. So we know that the lion was Babylon, known for pride, the feet of the bear, Medo and Persia, harsh laws, the body of the leopard, which was Greece, and the power came of the dragon, which was Rome. So what we find here is that Revelation keeps painting this very clear picture of who this beast is that the woman sits on. Right? So the woman sits on 7 kingdoms, heads being kingdoms. Now, we read in the next verse how, and here is the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. Now, again, mountains in the Bible are kingdoms. But just a quick little detour, I think it's pretty interesting. If you were just to try to research this and say, okay, where has 7 hills? Where are the 7 hills? Where are the 7 mountains? And Rome, just, if you Google that, you'll find out that it's widely recognized that Rome was built on 7 hills. And this is the home of the Catholic Church, right? Which is pretty interesting that, the 7 hills mean ultimately 7 kingdoms. The 7 mountains mean 7 kingdoms, but there's another application that's a literal application that I think is interesting. We also find that there's a second one that's home to 7 hills, and this is the 7 hills of Istanbul. And this was home to the Eastern Orthodox Church. So just right here, it's interesting how the 2 places with 7 hills, 2 cities were built in those. One was the center for the Catholic Church in the West. One was center for the Orthodox Church in the East. And it's interesting how both of these played an interesting part. We researched the East-West Schism, or the Great Schism of 1054. And this was all about ultimately understanding the differences between doctrines, but also it's the Catholic Church trying to put their dominance across globally. So that's just an aside. What this actually means is it means kingdoms. I just think it's very interesting that there's a second application to that. So let's continue reading. The beast that thou sawest interesting, there's three tenses here. Was, is not, so that's present, so this is speaking to this, and shall be, right? Shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition, and they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, that they should behold the beast that was, it is not, and yet is. Now, thinking through, we understand already who this is talking about. It's talking about the Catholic Church. So it was, for 1260 years, the dominant, right? Then it is not. This was doing the deadly wound. So this is the when General Berthier under Napoleon had captured the Pope and then in transit died, took a huge blow to the legitimacy of the Catholic Church and the power of the Catholic Church. And yet, it then was once more, it raised from the dead, right? It raised from, the deadly wound was healed, we read in an earlier chapter. So, this is returning to, again, there are 7 kings. Now, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is yet to come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. And the beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and of the 7, and goeth into perdition. Now, this can get confusing. I get it. So up to this point, everything is really clear. But then we get this new thing of 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet to come. Now, that is obviously referring to the past, the present, and the future. So if we look at the past, present, and the future, using that, the last thing we just learned of the was, the is not, and yet is, relating to the 1260, the deadly wound, and the wound being healed, what we'll find with this is that, that's the 7, right? Well, we read here that it says, and even he is the 8th, and is of the 7. Okay, so how can you be of the 7 and be an 8th? Well, it's talking about the wound being healed and coming back into power. Okay, so the idea here is that the beast does not have 8 heads; it only has 7, but the 7th head counts also as the 8th. And this is to say that the number 7 bears the number of 8, meaning that Revelation 17 tells us that there are only 7 heads on the dragon beast, and yet we see that there will be one be recurring. Okay? So it'll be the 8th because it comes back. So if we actually plot this, we see, and again, this is just the best to current knowledge. It's Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greek, Roman Empire. That's clear. Then we get into the division of the kingdoms, right? The 10 toes, right? That would be the 5th. Those were the was. The civil power of the United States, which is current, right? So when we look at it right now, the papacy has lost some of its power. The Catholic, the Protestant Church has gained a lot of power, right? It left, founded America, right? That was anti-Catholic at the time. The United States is currently the daughter, right? This is the under apostate Protestantism. So any Protestant, any Christian church that does not adhere to what the Bible has to preach, to say, ultimately is in apostate state. So what we see here is that that would be the one that is. And so the 8th, which has existed throughout Roman Empire, is also right. Is Roman Catholic Church was the Roman Empire, right? Is now coming back and to be a resurrected papal Rome, right? So again, what we're seeing here is that there is a resurrection of the 8th that is to come. So that's the resurrected papal Rome aligned with the kings of the world. So now what we see here is I recommend Stephen Bohr has some really good study notes on this, and I recommend taking a look at what he has to say. It says, it will be observed that in this scenario, 3 of the last 4 heads of the scarlet beast are Roman. Even the United States will become an ally of Rome because she will speak like a dragon. Again, I'm reading from his study notes. The question then begs this: what would 3 of the 7 heads apply to Rome? Isn't 1 head enough to represent the various stages of Rome? And the answer, he puts, is quite simple. The books of Daniel and Revelation themselves take up to 3 stages of Rome separately. Daniel 2, the legs of Rome, right, are distinguished under the feet of iron and clay. In Daniel 7:23 and 24, we see distinction between the dragon ruling itself and the dragon ruling with the other 10 horns. So that's kind of this idea. We see this is that there's 3 different levels of the same, they're just 3 different states or stages. Ellen White clearly identifies that the last 3 persecuting powers in their proper historical sequence. Under the symbols of the great red dragon, a leopard-like beast, and a beast with lamb-like horns, the earthly government, which would be especially engaged in trampling upon God's law and persecuting his people, were presented to John. Their war is to be carried on until the close of time. The people of God, symbolized by a holy woman and her children, are represented as greatly in the minority. In the last days, only a remnant still exists. John speaks of them as though they kept the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. So as we approach this last crisis, it is a vital moment in the harmony and unity exist among the Lord's instrumentalities. The world is filled with storm and war and variance. Yet under one head, the papal power, the people will unite under the pose of God in the person of his witness. So we continue reading, and the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as of yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. Those that have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast, these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and they that are faithful, they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. So the 10 horns of the nations of Europe, those the 10 toes, rally under the banner of the Rome, right? They're also called the waters, where the horse sitteth. They that dwelleth, on the earth, whose names are written in the book of life. These nations give the end-time church-state alliance, which is Babylon the Great, and all of their strength to make war against Jesus, the Lamb, and the people. So these nations of the world will support Babylon's national Sunday law. They will enforce her decree, and those who disobey will not be allowed to buy or sell. Ultimately, they support legislation calling for the death of God's people. However, when Jesus delivers his faithful followers, the multitudes will have supported the great whore, finally realize they've been deceived and they'll be eternally lost. So that's my understanding. Now, with this, to be super candid with you, I'm still researching this one because I up to this point, everything's very clear to me. This one here, just to be super candid with you, I'm still researching as the 10 horns being the 10 kings, and just seeing if there's anything else. And I've looked through everything. I've looked through, are these 10 popes? Are these different 10 presidents? Are these consecutive or are these simultaneous? And I believe these are all, or I'm clear these are all simultaneous, right? So these are not consecutive kings. This aligns around the Europe, right, being the 10 toes. And yet, though, if this is relating to an end times, is there some other piece? For me, I think I'm good with the idea that these are ultimately the 10 toes that we find in Babylon. In Daniel. But again, just to be candid, I recommend that you continue to study for yourself on this one particular piece, as I am still also studying this for myself. But part that I do know is this. The so-called Christian world will be the theater of a great and decisive actions. Men in authority will enact laws, controlling the conscience after the example of the papacy. Babylon will make all nations drink of the wine and the wrath of her fornication. So there's going to be a universal bond of union, a great harmony, and a confederacy of Satan's forces. This oppressive power will be acting against religious liberty. We're already starting to see movements to kind of test the waters of how far personal liberties can be pushed. Finally, here. The 10 horns, so here we are. And he says to me, the waters which thou sawest, where the horse sitteth, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon these beasts, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and she shall eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. God has put in their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree, and to give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled, and the woman which thou sawest in that great city, which reigned over the kings of the earth. So the 10 horns, I believe, are the nations of Europe, right? The nations of essentially now the 10 kingdoms being the nations of the world, in the sense of the time frame. All the earth, essentially, will rally under the banner of Rome. And we found that in Daniel 7 and 24. So what we're looking at here is that these are going to form that alliance and ultimately make war against the Lamb. But we find out here that they're going to find out that the nations will ultimately turn on Babylon, will actually turn on the papacy. And when we actually go into thinking, if we go back into the previous chapter, when we saw the 5th plague being poured out, and then the 6th plague, those are actually retaliation against the papacy. When the 5th plague comes and darkness falls over the papacy, over the Vatican, what we end up finding out is that the Vatican is not exempt from the plagues. And so now the merchants of the earth and the kings, right, all of them turn against the papacy. And that's what we ultimately find out. So again, this is a calling out of both the papacy and as well as anyone else who's in alignment with or following the same doctrinal beliefs, right, the daughters of the papacy. Hopefully this helps you, and I pray that you continue to study on your own. The following chapter 18 will deal with some of the similar methods, and I look forward to continuing this series with you. God bless.